So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "What signs are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing?" "Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You guys see a theme in all of our readings today? I wish I would have read all of those readings. I actually just started, when I started studying for the sermon, I read Exodus and I was like, I'm going to preach on this. And that was enough. But I always think of my brother who talks about the gospel, and he was preaching on the gospel this morning, he told me, and Pastor Steve and Pastor Eric, actually, when he was teaching me how to preach, he's like, "Hey, I'm telling you, it's always easiest to preach on the gospel." He's like, "But I encourage you to look at the other texts and see if anything stands out to you." And so again, when I was getting ready for the sermon, I started with the Old Testament text. I read it, and something popped in my mind, and I was like, I'm going to stick with that one. And I probably should have done a little bit more research on the other ones, because I did see a theme in this. It would have been nice to have known that before 9:45 this morning, but in any case, it didn't stop me from telling my brother when I called him this week. I'm like, "Hey, what are you going to preach on?" He said, "John." And before he even said anything at all, I started ragging. "Oh, of course you are. It's like the gospel, the easiest of all the texts to preach on. I'm sure you are." And we had a good laugh. And anyway, I miss him almost as much as I miss you guys. And I miss being at Grace and seeing you guys every week. I think I've shared with you guys before that Pastor Steve had been encouraging me for a while to find a church close to my home, right? He kept saying, "Hey man, I know you're driving all the way out here for church." He's like, "You really should find a good congregation close to you." And so I think I shared with you guys that I began that search about a year and a half ago, and I started bouncing around from different church to different church, and I just wasn't finding what I was looking for. I was finding good churches. They were fine. Some of them were just mega churches. They had thousands of people, and you just get lost in a place like that, and it wasn't for me because I came from this church. And as I kept bouncing around, I finally stumbled across a church in Rancho Cucamonga called Rock Hill Church. It's a little church off of Foothill and Haven, and the senior pastor there is a guy named Matt Chappell, which I thought was an appropriate name for a pastor. Younger guy, he can't be more than 34 or 35 years old, but a good Bible-preaching pastor. And it's going really well there, right? They're very big about volunteering, getting people to join into the service in some capacity or another, joining into what the church offers. And so within 2 weeks, they had pulled me into a combination of what's called the usher team, where you sit out in front just when people come in, you shake hands, welcome people, say hi, introduce yourself. And then there's another team called venue control, which is a nice term for security, basically, where if something bad ever happens, it's my job to drag somebody out of church. And I was like, has this ever happened before? And they told me stories about a guy from another country that kept trying to kiss Pastor Matt on the cheek, and they had to "Sir, we don't do that here," or whatever it is. And that guy wouldn't stop, and they had to make him leave. And I've been told that we've had people protesting at our church, not because our church is bad or because we do anything wrong, but because they don't like Christians. And so we've had people protesting outside of our church, and they've never had to do anything because the people have stayed off of the property, but we kind of stand there and just make sure that they don't do anything that's not appropriate or whatever, and that's venue control. And so I got pulled onto these two teams, and honestly, it's going very well. I really, really like this church. I'm getting spiritually fed there is probably the right term. Pastor Matt, the way he preaches, he puts on a good sermon, he does a really good job. He has something interesting that he does at the end of the sermon, though. At the end of every sermon, he finishes the sermon and he says, let us pray. And we go to prayer. And in this prayer, he will recap his sermon, and then there will be like a call to the congregation, and he does it very, very well. If he was preaching the sermon that I'm going to preach to you guys today, which is about trusting God, right? We're talking about Exodus and them relying on God to provide for them. If he was doing that, he would finish the sermon, he would go to prayer, and he would say to the congregation while we're in prayer, he would say, if you felt called today to begin putting your trust in God, if you felt a calling from God today in this sermon where you should start putting your faith in God and really trusting in him in your own life, would you put your hand up for me? And I have found it very interesting because he does it every single sermon. And almost every sermon, guys, the way he does it, his sermons and the way he does his call, I find myself like, I put my hand up almost every Sunday because I'm like, yeah, I do feel called to be better in this area of my life. And it's all different areas. The point of me sharing this with you guys is that like I'm engaged there. He does a really good job of like engaging, and I'm like, yeah, like I got something good out of this sermon, and it almost sets you on the next week where it's like, yeah, like I'm going to be better about this, and I really, really like it. That being said, I really, really do miss this church. Even coming back to Covina, it makes me happy. It makes me sad at the same time, but like I was excited to come here and preach for you guys and see all your faces because I do miss you guys very much. As most of you know, right, like I grew up in this church. When Nellie and I started dating, I brought her to this church, and we got married when we were here, and then COVID kind of sent us back to our house where we kind of found our new church and everything like that. But when Nellie and I got married, I think I shared with you guys before that we got a dog, right? We have a dog named Tucker, who's a beagle. And Tucker was our first beagle, the first beagle I've ever owned, and didn't really know what to expect with this dog. The one thing about beagles, if you guys don't know, is that their noses lead them everywhere that they're going, right? These are like hound dogs, and it's bred inside of these dogs that they have very, very strong scents, right? And so they can smell, they can smell things very, very well. And we learned pretty quick with Tucker that nose was going to get him in trouble. In our backyard, Tucker he goes in the backyard, he's got his nose to the ground, and he's just like everywhere he goes. And it took about 3 weeks with Tucker for him to find a foxtail in our backyard. And he snorted that foxtail right up his nose. And we knew pretty quickly something was wrong because he was sitting up there just rubbing his nose. And we took him to the vet. They said he probably sucked something up in his nose. They had to put him under anesthesia. And $600 later, they showed us a bloody foxtail. And they were like, yeah, this is what he got. And it was like, all right, well, we have 1 billion of those in our backyard. How do we... And so I became a foxtail catcher at that point, where it was my job to get the foxtails out of the backyard the best I could. It didn't work because 6 months later, he snorted another one up his nose. It was another $600. And that was just Tucker, right? We figured the foxtail thing out, and that only happened 2 or 3 times, I think. And after Tucker passed away not too long ago, we got our second dog. And this was Nellie's choice, so don't judge me by the breed of this dog. But we now have a golden doodle, which is a poodle. It's a golden retriever and a poodle mixed together, right? So this dog is like 45 or 50 pounds. He's a bigger dog. He's lean. He's fast. Ollie is the exact opposite of Tucker when we go on walks. Now, when somebody walks in my front door, Ollie he's a little scared of him at first, but then he comes to terms with the fact that there's somebody in the house that he doesn't know, and he warms up to them, and he's okay, and he kind of finds his place or whatever it is. But the minute Ollie goes outside on a walk, I mean, this world that he goes into, he loves his walks, but he is terrified out there. He's scared, he's skittish, and the way he walks is he will walk to the end of the leash, he'll walk about 10 steps ahead, and he'll stop and turn back and make sure that, it's usually me and Jackson that are taking him on a lot of these walks. He'll turn back, make sure we're there, and then he'll keep going. And then he'll walk for another 10 steps, he'll stop, he'll turn back, and then he'll run back to us and kind of sniff and look, make sure we're still there, and then he'll keep going. And this isn't at the beginning of the walk. The entire walk, this is how Ollie walks. He walks 10 steps ahead, checks, comes back, makes sure you're there, and then keeps going. And he bounces back the entire way. I mean, if we walk a mile, Ollie's walking 2 miles because he spends his entire walk going back and forth, right? And this kind of leads me, this weird tendency that Ollie has leads me to our preaching text today, right? If you would, turn with me to Exodus chapter 16, which is our Old Testament text. And this is a story that we're likely familiar with, right? Where God feeds the Israelites in the desert with manna and with the quail, right? And so when God does this, he doesn't give the Israelites enough food for the year. He doesn't give them a whole storehouse full of food. He doesn't give them enough for a month. He doesn't even give them enough for a week. If you read this text, God gives them just enough for the day, right? God wants us to act like Ollie. He wants us to be checking in with him regularly, relying on God, trusting in God, back and forth in a constant relationship where it's like, hey, I rely on this person to make sure that my safety and my security is there, right? As I was getting ready for the sermon, I was thinking about Ollie and the way he is, and I was like, man, this is a lot like God wants us to be with him, right? 10 steps forward, 10 steps back, making sure that we're still connected to God. In our text today, we see the importance that God places on this, right? On an ongoing reliance and trust in him. Now, before we get too far into our preaching text today, I do want to establish some context, because this is what really stood out to me as I was getting ready for this sermon. Now, we're in the book of Exodus, of course. Exodus is the second book of the Bible, first book of the Bible being Genesis. And if you go to the very end of Genesis, at the end of Genesis, we hear about Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, right? And Joseph passes away at the age of 110 years old. We're told that Joseph is buried in Egypt, and then it spills right over into the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus talks about a new king that has come into place in Egypt at this time. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6 says, "Now Joseph and all of his brothers and all of that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was full of them." It goes on to say, "A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. This is the beginning of a very long stretch of bad times for the Israelite people, right? I'm not talking 10 or 20 or even 100 years. This is over 400 years of slavery, of enslavement at the hand of the Egyptians, right? And we know this story, don't we, guys? This is like the story that we're all taught in school as kids and in church as kids. Next, Moses is born, right? And God calls Moses to stand up to Pharaoh, and God shows Moses multiple signs of his power, and Moses says, I'm not ready for this. And he's like, look, you can do this. Let me show you, here's all these things. And Moses and his brother Aaron go before Pharaoh, and they utter those 4 famous words, right? Let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, not going to do it. And Moses began to warn him. He says, hey, I've got God on my side, right? Like, this is the creator of the universe. Like, are you sure you want to go up against this guy? And Pharaoh's not persuaded by what's happening here. Creator of the universe, right? This term. I was at lunch this week I have a couple guys in my neighborhood. We always try to do lunch together. And I told my buddies pretty early on in this lunch, I was like, hey, I'm not going to be able to stay very long today. I got to go home and write the sermon for church. And they started giving me a hard time. They were like, well, you can do it later. You can do whatever. My friend Dane, who I really, really like, Dane suggested that I use artificial intelligence. If you guys know what ChatGPT is, right? You just have ChatGPT write the sermon for you. And I stopped and I kind of looked over him and I said, I don't think I'm going to have artificial intelligence write a story about the creator of the universe for me, Dane. So that doesn't seem like the right move here. And we all kind of laughed about it. But the creator of the universe, right? That's who Moses is talking to Pharaoh about. He said, I've got the creator of the universe on my side. Are you sure you want this, right? Pharaoh says, I'm not scared of you. I'm not scared of him. And that's when the plagues come, right? We know all about the plagues, right? Moses turns the Nile to blood. He then sends frogs on the land. Gnats, flies, the livestock dies. Boils on people's skin, hail from above, locusts, the entire land goes dark, and it's not until the firstborn of all of the sons of Egypt die that Pharaoh's like, okay, all right, I give up. And finally, Pharaoh says he's had enough. And that's kind of the short version of what happens in Exodus, right? And that brings us up to our preaching text today. That got us all the way up to Exodus chapter 16. And that's where we find the Israelites are off into the wilderness. They're finally free from Egypt, and they are hungry, right? Verse 2 of our preaching text says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and all the food that we wanted, but you brought us out here in the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. As I was preparing for the sermon, I got to this point, and I got real high and mighty, right? I was like, the Israelites. I can't believe this. After all that, they still don't trust God. And it was because I had read all of Exodus up to this point that I saw all these crazy things that had happened, and I just could not believe that after all that, they didn't trust God, right? And so, looking back, we know about all these miracles and all the things that happened. There's a couple of things that are overlooked in this journey that the Israelites had before they end up here at our preaching text, right? First of all, Moses was a nobody, right? This would be like me saying, hey, guys, I'm going to go to the White House this weekend. I'm going to talk to the president because I have some things that I need to share with him. And it's like, Chairman, you're not getting in the door of the White House. But somehow Moses, an absolute nobody, stands in front of Pharaoh, the king of all of the land, and has these discussions with him, right? Then Moses sends all of these plagues. And the Israelites, they were there, right? They saw all of these plagues happen in their defense, right? This is happening to let these people go. Like, they know what's happening with all of this. But then something amazing happens while the Israelites are on their way out. And this is one of the most overlooked things that you almost miss in Exodus. If you look at Exodus chapter 12, it says, the Egyptians, after the firstborn of all the land passed away, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave their country. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. It says that in there, guys, right? And it's something that I don't think about very often. On the way out of 400 years of slavery, they took the gold and the clothes of the Egyptians on the way out, right? God put this on their hearts to say, hey, you're not going to leave empty-handed. They left with gold and silver and clothing. And it doesn't stop there, right? Exodus 13, verse 20 tells us, after leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and at night, a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud nor the pillar of fire that night left its place in front of the people. So they don't just walk out of Egypt like not sure where we're going. There's a gigantic pillar of cloud during the day that they're following, and a gigantic pillar of fire by night that they're following, right? And so I was thinking about this. If you look back in chapter 12 in Exodus, and then again in Numbers, Moses mentions a number of how many people he has with him. Now, he mentions it like this. He says that he has 600,000 men on foot, which I was reading into this and studying this more. This refers to men who are probably between the ages of 20 and 60, who are military-ready men, military-aged men, and that's who he mentions, 600,000 of them. It does not include any of the children. It doesn't include any of the women. It doesn't include any of the elderly people. Scholars have estimated that when you add all of those people up, it wasn't 600,000 people leaving Egypt. It was somewhere between 2 to 3 million people is who marched out of Egypt during the Exodus. My question for you is, how big of a pillar of fire do you need to lead 2 or 3 million people, right? This wasn't a little cloud of fire or a pillar of cloud by day. This was likely a gigantic, 30,000 foot cloud that they're seeing, that they're following out of this place after God rescued them from Egypt. This wasn't some small feat. I've been following this page on Instagram, which is, ironically, it's artificially intelligence photos. Like it's photos that AI created, but it's biblical people if they had smartphones, and it's like the coolest photos, right? The one that I remember first was Daniel in the lion's den, and so it's Daniel with his phone pointed towards his face, and there's a bunch of, and he's got a scared look on his face, and there's a bunch of lions like coming in around him, right? And there's another one of Jonah in the ocean with a scared look on his face and bubbles coming out of his mouth, and there's a giant whale coming from behind him, right? And he's taking a selfie of it. And another one was Jesus taking a selfie on the boat while the waves are crashing, and all the disciples are scared behind him, but Jesus is totally calm and he takes a selfie. And all these funny photos. One of these photos had, if I was better prepared for this sermon, I would have put it up on the board for you guys right now, and I'm really, really sorry that I didn't do that. But one of these photos was a picture of an Israelite turning back, and all the Israelites are marching ahead of him, and he takes a picture, and it's got the pillar of fire, like in the middle of the night, like leading the way. It was a really, really cool picture. And again, I really just should have put it up on the board for you guys, but you have to use your imaginations to get through this anyway. This was a gigantic, sign from God that he's leading them out of Egypt and into the promised land, right? All of this stuff is happening. all of this stuff that's happening, and once this happens, right, we know what comes next after this. After the Israelites finally get out of there, Pharaoh changes his mind. He sends his armies to come and get them, and then we see one of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament, right? Moses, in front of the Israelites, parts the Red Sea, and they all walk through it, and when Pharaoh's armies go in, he crushes them with the ocean, and that really does catch us up to our preaching text. Like, these are the things that these people have seen, right? And they're still not on with trusting God, which I thought was really, really wild. And what leads them to kind of freak out here, right, is that they are hungry, right? We get to this point in our preaching text where we find the disciples are hungry. And hopefully Nellie's not watching this online. She might be watching it. If she is, I'll be in trouble when this is over. But if she's not, at least I use her as an example. When Nellie hasn't been fed in a while, she gets hungry, right? And like the Snickers commercial says, she doesn't just get hungry, she gets angry. And when you combine those two things together, it's called hangry, where you're just a mad, hungry person, right? And that's where the Israelites are at right now, is that they're hangry with Moses and Aaron. Verse 2 says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat, our bellies were full, but you brought us here in the desert to starve, right? And so despite everything, despite Moses, the plagues, let my people go, they walked out with gold and silver, they followed this cloud through the night and through the day, literally watched Moses part the Red Sea. Despite having gone through all of that, they still didn't trust God. And so then I was like, you know what? Maybe a bunch of time had gone by. Maybe that was years had gone by before they ended up in this desert, and so they forgot about all of God's things. No, there wasn't even that either, right? Verse 16 literally says, the whole Israelite community set out for Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they came out of Egypt, right? So I did the math on this. The 15th day after the second month, carry the one. This was 45 days. Like, this just happened. All that stuff just happened. It was fresh in their mind. And still, they don't think that God is going to show up for them at this time, right? And this is the point, like I said, that I got real high and mighty, where I was like, these Israelites, this is shameful that you wouldn't trust God after all of that. However, after really considering everything and thinking about my own life and my own faith journey, I will say this. I determined that I am exactly like the Israelites, that my personal faith journey has been littered with doubt and fear and anxiety, despite the fact that God has continually showed up in my life and taken care of me in my tough times, right? I still doubt that God is going to show up for me, and so I can't really be that mad at the Israelites, is what I kind of determined at this part in my studying for this sermon. I think I've shared with you, and not I think, I know for a fact that I've shared with you guys that my testing God with faith probably didn't even really start until after my mom passed away. And that was a really, really hard time in my life. After she passed, and Fur and I stayed in her condo, and we lived there for a couple years while probate court decided who was gonna own that property or whatever it was. Taking care of our family dog and our family cat. That was probably the worst couple years I've had in my life. And having navigated through that, and then Nellie, my wife today, who was my girlfriend then, Nellie broke up with me. That is when I hit rock bottom, came back to this church, told Pastor Eric that I needed help, and he said, hey, I want to train you to preach. I want to really plug you into church here and stuff like that. And that was the moment that I really started praying to God and asking him to fix things in my life. And 9 months later, Nellie sent me a text message and said, hey, I think we should get together and talk. And from that time, I have been testing God ever since then, right? I've been praying to God about my marriage. I've been praying to him about my career. I've been praying to him about being a father, about being a husband. And I've seen God just show up for me time and time again. He continues to come through for me despite my fears and my doubts and my anxiety. Going back to Tucker and Ollie, right? Tucker was our first dog, the Beagle. And I think I might have shared this with you guys also. One of the most recent times that I really remember putting God to the test was when Tucker was 11 or 12 years old. He started showing signs of his aging. Tucker started getting slower on his walks. He started limping a little bit more with some of his legs. He wasn't able to jump up on the bed any longer. And he stopped. It's always a bad sign with a dog when they stop eating their food. His appetite really had started to disappear, and he wasn't eating very good. And I started considering that we were probably at the beginning of the end for this dog, right? And I just wasn't prepared for it. And so I started praying about Tucker, right? Some people just dogs are something you keep in the backyard or whatever, but for us, dogs are family, and like I love this dog. And so I started praying about Tucker, like on a regular basis. I started praying specifically that God would give us not just a couple more years, but a couple of good years with this dog. And I also prayed that God would make it very clear when the time was to come that we needed to be done with Tucker, that it was time to maybe put Tucker down or whatever that was. Just make it clear, God. And man, I'm telling you, God answered that prayer in such a wild way. It felt like it was almost overnight. I'm sure it wasn't, but it felt like it was almost overnight that Tucker stopped limping and Tucker started eating his food. And God gave us another 2 or 2.5 years with Tucker where he was just really, really healthy. And he walked every night with me. We were really, really good. And you know what, guys? It ended with one bad day. Tucker had one bad day where he just would not even get up from the little bed that he slept in. And I had to carry him into the emergency pet clinic. And there was, of course, at the emergency pet clinic, there's always a long wait. We were there for 3 or 4 hours. And while we were outside, Tucker was walking around kind of sniffing the grass. I had to pick him up and stand him up. And Tucker did something, I won't share the details of it with you, but Tucker did something out there that just told me very, very clearly, like, hey, you got a couple extra years with this dog and now is the time, right? And so when I went back into the emergency pet clinic, instead of telling them that I wanted them to figure out what was wrong with 14-year-old Tucker, I just said, hey, I'm not here for that anymore. Like, I think I'm just here to say goodbye to this dog, right? And we did. It was me, Nellie, and Jackson. We said goodbye. And it was actually a very good ending to an answer of prayer from God. And I thought, man, like God really showed up for me in that moment, right? That's a personal story. Let me go back to something that God is doing right now, not necessarily with me, but with this new church that I've been at, right? So Rock Hill Church, Pastor Matt Chapel, is limited by the little leased building that they have right in the back of a Target. So they're in this business district in Rancho Cucamonga, and they rent out this kind of L-shaped building. And the sanctuary, what is the sanctuary for this building is really, it's like a big conference room at best, where we can probably fit in about 100 and maybe 125, 130 seats at best, right? And this is a healthy, growing church. And so I go to the 8 o'clock service. There's a 9:30 service, an 11 o'clock service, and now they're also doing a 12:30 service because this church has 600 or 700 people that attend it, right? And so now they have 4 services and they're completely packed out, right? And I've been at a couple of these services where I've actually seen Pastor Matt walking around, and as we're getting ready for service and everybody comes and sits down, people keep coming in. And so part of the usher's team is to go and we get extra chairs, and we're always bringing these chairs in and setting them up to the point that it's like, hey, you have to have enough room for people to walk and stuff like that, but we're full, right? Like it is full in this church. And that's a turnoff for people when they show up and there's no place to sit. It's like, I guess I'll find a different church, right? I've looked at Pastor Matt as he's kind of looking at before church is getting ready and stuff, and I can see his worry and his concern where he's like, I don't know what we're supposed to do because we're limited by this, right? A couple of, probably 9 or 10 months ago, a building in Fontana came up. It's a church that is no longer worshiping there. A building came up for sale. Pastor Matt knows that I work in commercial finance, and he reached out to me and he was like, hey, could we qualify for a loan to buy this building? And I looked it up. Long story short, this building is being sold for $10 million. To buy a building that's worth $10 million, you have to come in with about $3 million cash, and you can finance the other $7 million. I looked over our church's financials, and the answer was, it wasn't even, we're close. Like, no, this is not the building for us, right? We can qualify for a loan probably about $2 million. We cannot qualify for a loan anywhere near what this is asking. He was very disappointed to hear that, right? And I was just, man, that's the reality of the situation. And so when that happened, I just thought, man, I'm not sure what's going to happen with this church. Like, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. If we're going to go to 5 services, 6 services, I was like, because we're not in a position to get into the building the size that we need. Well, wouldn't you know that in the exact same parking lot that my church uses to park in, there's a bunch of little offices and business and stuff like that. And if you go to the very back end of this parking lot, there is a gigantic church building back there that is occupied by a church called Transformation Calvary Chapel. And I knew that they were back there. I don't think about them very much because it's not my church and everything like that. Pastor Matt announced 3 weeks ago that they have been in discussions with Transformation Calvary Chapel, which is a small, kind of, I hate to use the term dying congregation, but it's a church that has really shrunk to only about 35 or 40 people. They have a gigantic sanctuary and a really beautiful campus. And the leadership of that church has been talking to the leadership of my church, and they decided that they were going to do a merger because their pastor is getting ready to retire, and now our pastor is going to be the pastor of both of these churches, and they've invited us to come over and basically take over this building for them. And so not only did God show up and put us in a building, he put us in a building literally in the same parking lot that we are in right now. Like, instead of parking over here, now I park up here. And we had our first service 3 weeks ago, and it was funny because this church building seats 900 people, and we had standing room only for this because everybody showed up. And so instead of having 4 services, now we're down to 2. We worship at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and with it all spread out, like, God showed up on this one too. And I don't know, you guys know me. Anxiety is something I just deal with. I'll worry about anything, whether it has to do with me or not. I'll think about, like, here's something to worry about. I'm worried about this church. I've thought, I wonder what's going to happen. I've seen my pastor stressing out. I've seen the look in his eyes where he doesn't know. I've worried about this, and this is the problem that God just decided 3 weeks ago that he was going to show up and just solve for this church. And so without doing anything, we have a new building to worship in, and God put a place for this congregation with nothing on the horizon and just popped in. I thought this was just absolutely incredible that God showed up here, right? The more I think about what's happening in my life, what's happening with Rock Hill Church, the way that God has showed up for me, right? I am convinced, guys, I assure you today that God will work in your lives if you let him, right? It takes some surrender. It takes some commitment. It takes some faith. I've tried it both ways, but I promise you, if you put your trust in God, he will deliver. Maybe it's time that we all show up and do that, right? Amen?
Amen.